The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Madam Speaker, at a time when Canadians are struggling to put food on their tables, when the dream of home ownership in Canada is just that, a dream for many young Canadians, and when our country is plagued by so many other serious challenges brought upon us by the failed policies of this incompetent and reckless NDP Liberal government, here we are again this afternoon continuing debate on this government's failure to live up to its responsibilities and your order, Speaker, to produce important documents pertaining to the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Green Slush Fund scandal. In fact, this is my second time speaking on this important issue. But today, I'm here debating the amendment that would replace the reporting date of Friday, November 22nd, with the following, the 30th sitting day following the adoption of the order. Speaker, this change makes sense given the uncertainty around when debate on this important issue will finish. No one knows for sure that when that will be, but Conservatives are doing our part holding this corrupt Liberal government to account until they hand over the ordered and unredacted SDTC documents to the RCMP. While Friday, November 22nd sounds far away, it is in fact just around the corner when you consider Remembrance Day is on Monday, and next week all members of Parliament will be in their constituencies catching up with their constituents, local stakeholders, and their families. By the time we return to this place, it will be November 18th, and the 22nd is that Friday. When November 22nd was first proposed in the motion, no one could have imagined we would be continuing to debate this issue in the House of Commons. Back then, it sounded like a reasonable and realistic date to set as a deadline. However, this Liberal government has dug in their heels, and they're refusing to budge. That's how Canadians watching from home know they're hiding something. And that something must be very concerning. That's why we're here today, Speaker, to hold this corrupt government to account. Speaker, it dismays me greatly that since the first time I debated this subject a few weeks ago, the Liberals have still not done what's right and hand over the ordered and unredacted SDTC documents to the RCMP. Consequently, the House of Commons remains seized by this issue and paralyzed to move on from it. Speaker, for those watching at home, SDTC was established by the Government of Canada in 2001. As a federally funded foundation, it was responsible for the approval and disbursement of over $100 million annually in taxpayer funds to help Canadian companies develop and deploy sustainable technologies. For many years, SDTC operated responsibly and earned a generally good reputation for its work. However, that all changed in 2019 when former Liberal Industry Minister Navdeep Bains appointed Annette Verschuren as chair of SDTC. The issue at hand was a matter of conflict of interest. Verschuren was an entrepreneur who was already receiving SDTC funding through one of her companies, and now she was appointed by this NDP Liberal government to hold responsibilities overseeing those very same SDTC funds, the same funds her company was receiving. That fact alone should have sounded alarm bells and red flashing lights to alert everyone in the government about the obvious conflict of interest at hand. In fact, it was no secret. The Minister, the Prime Minister's office, and the Privy Council office all knew, and they were warned of the risks associated with appointing a conflicted chair. Yet those warnings fell on deaf ears, and the indifference as Verschuren was appointed by the Liberal minister anyways. How can you tell a government has lost its moral compass when it makes poor decisions like this one without concern for doing the right things and without fear of consequence? Only 2 years later, Minister Bains announced in January 2021 that he had decided to step away from politics and not run again in the upcoming federal election. That same year, SDTC entered into a 5-year, $1 billion agreement with the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. Fast forward to the fall of 2024, and it's clear that the Liberals are trying desperately to run away and wash their hands of this mess, one in which they laid the foundation for through their own actions, and especially after the Auditor General released a scathing report about SDTC in June of 2024. The AG found massive issues at SDTC, which resulted in the current Minister of Industry, the Honourable Member for St. Maurice Champlain, abolishing the SDTC and immediately transferring its funds over to the National Research Council of Canada instead. These are truly astonishing developments in just 3 years for something this Liberal government doesn't want to talk about anymore. So what did the AG find that was so bad to cause all this carnage? In June 2024, the AG found that SDTC demonstrated significant, and this is quote, significant lapses in governance and stewardship of public funds, end quote. Nearly 20% of the SDTC projects examined by the AG were in fact ineligible, based on the government's own rules for funding, with a total price tag of $59 million. There were also 90 instances where the SDTC ignored conflict of interest provisions while awarding $76 million to various projects. Indeed, the AG found 63 cases where SDTC agency directors voted in favor of payments to companies in which they declared interests. Further, there were serious matters of governance, including the fact that the board didn't even have the minimum number of members required by law. The report concluded that not managing conflicts of interest, whether real, perceived, or potential, increases the risk that an individual's duty to act in the best interests of the foundation is affected, particularly when making decisions to award funding. It also blamed the government's Minister of Industry, whose ministry did not sufficiently monitor the contribution agreements with SDTC. But believe it or not, it gets far worse, far, far worse. Since June, the Auditor General found that directors had awarded funding to projects that were ineligible and where conflicts of interest existed. The Auditor General found that over $300 million in taxpayer money was paid out in over 180 cases where there was a potential conflict of interest, with Liberal-appointed directors funneling money to companies they own. Time after time, this Liberal government and its Prime Minister has shown total contempt for Canada's ethics laws. In fact, the Prime Minister himself has been the subject of 3 ethics investigations and was found guilty of breaking ethics laws twice. The Liberal government allows the culture of law-breaking to persist, as 6 Liberals have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. They've gone through these ethical scandals before. That's why they're withholding these documents, breaching parliamentary privilege, and trying desperately to sweep this mess under the rug and move on to the next thing. But common sense Conservatives are not going to let them get away with it, Speaker. We are holding this corrupt NDP Liberal government to account. They will be held responsible for their carelessness, recklessness, and corruption. That's why on June 10, 2024, the House of Commons adopted the following motion proposed by Common Sense Conservatives on this matter. The motion read that the House order the Government, Sustainable Technology Canada, and the Auditor General of Canada each to deposit with the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council within 30 days of the adoption of this order the following documents, created or dated since January 1, 2017, which are in its or her possession, custody, and control. The motion then details what documents were to be supplied and then directed that the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council shall provide forthwith any documents received by him pursuant to this order to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This common sense Conservative motion passed with the support of the New Democrats, Green Party, and Bloc Québécois. Only the Liberals opposed it. To be clear, nothing in the motion orders the RCMP to conduct an investigation. The House is simply asking that the documents be turned over to the RCMP. 30 days came and went, and instead of complying with the adopted motion, federal departments outright refused the House order or provided heavily redacted documents citing provisions in the Privacy Act or the Access to Information Act. Speaker, this is not a good look. Further, nothing in the House order contemplated redactions to documents being made by this government. That's because the House of Commons enjoys the absolute and unfettered power to order the production of documents that is not limited by statute. These powers are rooted in the Constitution Act of 1867 and the Parliament of Canada Act. In response to the NDP Liberal government's failure to produce these documents, the Conservative House Leader raised a point of privilege, rightfully, arguing that the House privilege had been breached due to the failure to comply with the House order. On September 26, Speaker, you issued a ruling on the point of privilege raised and found that the privileges of this House had in fact been breached. Now, nearly a month later, we continue our important debate on this matter today and continue our demands for this Liberal government to provide the RCMP with the unredacted SDTC documents. Speaker, you have ruled this government has violated a House order to turn over evidence to the RCMP into their latest $400 million green slush fund scandal. The NDP Liberal government's refusal to respect your ruling has paralyzed Parliament, pushing aside all other work to address issues such as the cruel and crippling carbon tax, the cost of living crisis Canadians face for food and shelter, and the increasing crime, disorder, and chaos in our streets and in our communities and cities. This is happening at a time when the cost of food, fuel, and shelter are all up, and millions of Canadians are having to line up outside of food banks just to survive. Sadly, as Canadians continue to struggle, life for well-connected Liberals and insiders has never been so good. One of the drivers of this hardship is the cruel NDP Liberal carbon tax. In fact, this carbon tax will cost the average Ontarian $903 this year. This is completely unacceptable to the constituents in my communities of Niagara Falls, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Fort Erie, who work hard for their money, who save carefully for their futures, and who dream of a better tomorrow. Instead of doing anything about climate change, the NDP Liberal carbon tax is impoverishing Canadians. Recently, the PBO confirmed that Canadians will suffer a net cost paying more in the carbon tax than they will ever get back in rebates. Unfortunately, the NDP Liberal government doesn't care. Instead of giving Canadians the tax relief they deserve, they hiked the carbon tax by 23% last spring as part of their plan to quadruple the carbon tax by 2030. Turns out the carbon tax is not a tool to fight climate change like the Prime Minister argues, it's just another tax grab. Canadians can add it to the long and growing list of Liberal NDP taxes that they already pay, including the income tax, sales tax, excise tax, underused housing tax, property tax, capital gains tax, and more. After listing all those taxes, it's easy to see why Canadians are getting poorer. It's because this government is taking more of their hard-earned money away. The SDTC scandal is also happening at a time when costs are up on food. In fact, food will cost families $700 more this year than it did in 2023. That's because when you tax the farmer who grows the food, and the trucker who ships the food, and the store who stores and sells the food, you end up taxing the family who buys the food. As Sylvain Charlebois, Canada's food professor, who serves as director of Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Lab, has said, the costly NDP Liberal carbon tax likely adds a significant cost burden to the Canadian food industry. When it comes to food, Canadians are going hungry. That's evident by the massive surge in demand and need for food banks. Food bank usage has increased every year this NDP Liberal government has been in office because its inflationary spending and punishing carbon tax have hiked up the price of groceries, causing Canadians to skip meals, eat less healthy food, and rely on food banks to survive. This was confirmed recently by Feed Ontario, who revealed that a record 1 million people visited a food bank in Ontario in 2024. This is a dramatic increase of 25% from the previous year. In fact, Feed Ontario's CEO told media that, I quote, "I never thought I would see this day." Feed Ontario CEO went on to say, "I've been with the organization 15 years, and I've never thought I'd see this level of demand. I cannot believe we reached a point where numbers are so drastically high." Across Canada, food banks reported earlier this year that they had seen a 50% increase in visits since 2021, with food banks handling a record 2 million visits in a single month in 2023. Of the people visiting food banks in Ontario, 1 in 3 visitors are children. 1 in 6 adults visiting food banks are unemployed. This NDP Liberal government cost of living crisis has become so severe that even working Canadians are having to depend on food banks to get by. These numbers also reflect what is happening across Niagara. Try to wrap your head around some of these statistics from Project Share, which serves vulnerable residents in Niagara Falls. Last year, Project Share saw a 20% increase in people served this year compared to the previous year. 4,740 people accessed their services for the first time. 120 families on average per day accessed their essential support services. 13,995 people were served last year, which equates to 1 in 7 residents of Niagara Falls having accessed their essential support services last year. We should be debating these issues, Speaker, and we can if this government simply abided by your ruling and provided the documents this House has requested. Why are they so hesitant to do what is right? Is it that they don't want to speak to the situation facing young Canadians and first-time home buyers, which is so bad that the Canadian dream of home ownership is dying? 2/3 of young people believe they will never be able to afford a home. Canadians see this housing crisis most tragically in our streets, where there are now 1,800 homeless encampments across Ontario and thousands more across the country. Time after time, the NDP Liberal government has promised to fix the housing crisis. But the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has been clear that the number of new homes being built isn't enough to reduce the existing supply gap and improve affordability for Canadians. Crime is also getting worse under the watch of this NDP Liberal government. And perhaps, again, this is why they refuse to hand over these documents, so we cannot debate these issues, which are so important to all constituents. Since 2015, when the Liberals formed government, the number of auto thefts have skyrocketed by 45%. Violent crime has increased 50%. Human trafficking is up 73%. Hate crimes have increased by 251%. And just recently, the Toronto Police Association had to come out publicly and fact-check the Prime Minister. The reality is the Liberal soft-on-crime approach is making life easier for violent criminals by repealing mandatory minimum sentences for gun crimes with Bill C-5 and making it easier to get bail with Bill C-75 and failing to stop the flow of illegal guns across the U.S. border. These issues I noted are all pressing issues parliamentarians should be debating, but the House of Commons is seized because this government is refusing to comply with the House order to hand over SDTC documents to the RCMP. Speaker, Canadians are suffering great hardship after 9 years of this NDP Liberal coalition. The country is headed in the wrong direction, and we are all worse off than we were 10 years ago. Speaker, you have ruled this government has violated a House order to turn over evidence to the RCMP into their latest Liberal $400 million green slush fund scandal. The Liberal government's refusal to respect your ruling has paralyzed Parliament, pushing aside all other debate. It's time for the Liberals to end their corrupt cover-up and provide the order documents to the police so Parliament can get back to work and Canadians can have the accountability they so rightly deserve. Thank you, Madam Speaker.